Welcome, everybody. My name is Elizabeth Aloni. I'm with Schneps Media. Schneps Media is the largest local media company in New York Metro. We publish over 70 newspapers, magazines, websites, webinars, podcasts, and events throughout Queens, Brooklyn, the Bronx, Manhattan, Westchester, Long Island, and Philadelphia. Today, we're thrilled to bring you a very important webinar, Cyber Attacks in the Remote Workplace. And we have brought together some of the top experts to talk to you about it. COVID-19 has led to significant security exposure as companies have transitioned to remote environments. And this has led to an even greater need to understand how to protect our companies. Today, our panel of experts will share about trending cyber topics, risk management, and insurance solutions. First up, I'd like to introduce Preetam Dutta. Preetam is the co-founder and chief executive officer at Elpha Security, a highly regarded and accomplished multidisciplinary cybersecurity researcher. Preetam is also a passionate advocate for STEM education for students in underprivileged areas and leads an education to employment pathway for students in cybersecurity as a national board member at Schools That Can. His most recent publication, Privacy and Synthetic Datasets in the Stanford Technology Law Review, proposes a new method of maintaining the privacy of confidential data without impairing the utility of the data for machine learning applications. Preetam graduated with a PhD in cybersecurity and machine learning from Columbia University and a BS from Yale University. Welcome, Preetam.
Thank you for that introduction, Elizabeth, and thank you to the Sterling team for hosting this as well. It's an absolute pleasure to speak to you all about cybersecurity, which, as Elizabeth mentioned, I've spent a good portion of my life on. And so with that, I'd love to tell you about cybersecurity and what I've learned over the years of working as an active practitioner. There is a multitude of cyber attacks taking place. I think I don't need to tell anyone who's listening in on this webinar that if you open the TV, you can't have a moment where you don't hear about a cyber attack. Even if when you watch the Super Bowl, some of the commercials were about cybersecurity companies. It just tells you about how important the cyber landscape is becoming and how it's an inevitable part of our lives and our businesses' lives. A single cyber attack can actually put a business out of business, which is a very scary fact to us all. When you think about the cyber attacks that you can face for a company, it can be very wide-ranging. It can be a phishing attack, which is very simply an email that is sent to you. They pretend to be an employee or someone you trust, and they ask you for information which can be used to compromise your company. For example, I often receive phishing emails from people who pretend to be in my organization and tell me, hey, why don't you share this document with me about X, Y, and Z customer? I personally don't even know how they know who the customer is, and I don't know how they make these really realistic looking emails. However, these emails are meant to trick me into sharing information about someone that is very valuable to our business. This is an example of a phishing attack, and that's just one of many. The most common that I'm sure everyone's hearing a lot about is ransomware. A cyber criminal comes into your organization and effectively encrypts all of your data, and they sell you that encryption key, or actually a decryption key at that point, to get your data back. This makes it a really challenging process because as a small business owner, I can just imagine how stressful it would be if I'm relying on this data and it gets taken away from me. And that's where the cyber criminals take advantage of you. They take advantage of knowing that you need that data, and they'll sell that key back to you. And that's just an example. Phishing, ransomware, those are two examples. There's more complicated cyber attacks that are taking place, but those are two of the ones that we have seen very commonly taking place in the marketplace today, especially with the work from home trend, where we're not getting to see our colleagues as much. When you're at home, you get emails or you get a text or you get other forms of communication. So it's much easier to impersonate someone that you trust. And as a small business, therefore, due to the huge landscape of attacks and threats out there, it's really important to consider your security posture. And what I mean by a security posture is, how am I protected in case a cyber event takes place? If someone is trying to hack me, what is my business resilience? What is my cyber resilience to an attack? And that's where your cyber posture is really important. And your cyber posture is only as good as its weakest link. So if you have a weak password in your entire ecosystem, but everything else is phenomenal, the weak password could be the chink in your armor that helps the cyber attacker break down your defenses. So when I talk about your cyber posture, it's a number of things. It's really, how does your company handle a cyber event? So how does it do identity management? How does it handle data? How does it do physical security? People can come in and steal your computers. Access control, third-party management, incident response, disaster recovery. The list goes on and on. Your security posture is very complicated and it's a living document. It's something that changes with time as your company matures. And especially in this remote working environment, our security postures are going through an evolution. We're facing new threats by being at home, and we need new security postures at home. For example, our business, Elpha Secure, has implemented that our employees use VPNs at home. What is a VPN? It basically makes sure that our data is encrypted when we access the internet. It's very important to make sure that our traffic is encrypted and protected, because you can have a cyber attacker who's trying to snoop on you. Essentially, there's a number of ways you can improve your cyber resilience, and that's really improving your security posture. The first step I would recommend to everyone on this call is make sure your passwords are recycled, meaning changed every 60, 90 days. Determine what is best for your organization. Passwords being stale is a huge attack vector. Make sure that you understand who you're communicating with before you send any email or confidential information. Basic protocols like that can help you bolster your security posture dramatically. But it's also very important that you put in good security products to protect your company, as well as cyber insurance, which we'll hear a lot of in the coming segments. But at the very least, from a security posture standpoint, I would highly recommend getting strong antivirus, strong network security protocols, insider threat protection, backup. The number one defense to ransomware is backup, unfortunately, because by the time most people can detect ransomware, your files are already encrypted. The way to get those cyber criminals is not to let them control you with the key, but to have your data backed up. And that's where you really have an advantage as a small business, is you can agilely develop a nice security posture. And if anyone needs any help with that, Elpha Secure is always here with our single tool. So with that, I'll pass it to David Sterling. And I'm sure he'll give you some really good insights into cyber insurance.
Thank you, Preetam. That was very valuable information. So what role does insurance play in cybersecurity? We're going to hear more about that from David Sterling to address that important issue. Let me tell you a little bit about David. He is the Chief Executive Officer at SterlingRisk, where he leads an organization of more than 220 professionals in 8 regional offices across the United States. He's highly regarded within the insurance industry and has extensive experience advising on cybersecurity issues and related exposures. David consulted on one of the first data breaches that exceeded 40 million individuals and the resulting litigation and insurance issues. He continues to consult on every facet of coverage design and claims handling for almost every industry touched by cybercrime. Beyond his professional accomplishments, David has served on numerous boards and advisory boards, including the Homeland Security Foundation. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Preetam, for that really good explanation of the ways to secure yourself in the current environments, including remote workplaces. Cyber insurance was a fairly new coverage about 10 years ago, and very few companies bought it, and it was very, very inexpensive. And even up to about a year or two ago, a typical middle market company could buy cyber insurance for a few $1,000s a year to cover all of their exposures with very little screening. That's changed. The claims that have been pouring in on these cyber insurance policies because of the different types of attacks that Preetam has been talking about have put the insurance companies on the defensive, and they've now been raising the rates. They've been asking a lot more questions and much more attentive to understanding the risks, and they've been issuing more restrictive insurance policies. As a result of that, our company, SterlingRisk, has partnered with Elpha Secure to introduce a new product that relies on a cybersecurity assessment And essentially, if somebody is running their company well and is assessed to have very few vulnerabilities, they're going to get a broad policy with low premiums. If they have significant vulnerabilities, they'll either pay more money or not get insurance coverage at all. And so what is the insurance coverage that addresses many of these exposures that Preetam was talking about? So the first one I'd like to talk about is what we refer to as network security and privacy protection. This is where somehow a hacker gets into your system and steals personally identifiable information that you have in your system. Many companies have that kind of information from their customers or others that they deal with. Think a medical office has all of the records of its patients. However, not everybody has that kind of information from their customers, but everybody has that information from their employees. And so this is a very, very important coverage. What it does is if you have a breach and if this information is taken, if you have third parties coming after you for the damages they've incurred as a result of their information being stolen, the policy will defend you from those lawsuits. In addition, there may be fines and penalties. So Visa and MasterCard, in exchange for providing the credit card services that you may use for your business, have rules that say if you compromise the personal identifiable information, the credit card information of those customers, that you are subject to fines and penalties. And what's interesting is it may not even be you who did it. You may use a third-party processor who was compromised. But if it's deemed that you're the one responsible for collecting that data, then you could be held responsible for some of these fines and penalties. So the network security and privacy protection will provide some coverage for that. In addition, there's response costs that will be reimbursed to you. For example, right now, the standard protocol for dealing with such a breach is to buy the people whose information was taken credit monitoring services. And those credit monitoring services can run $50 to $100 per year per person. And so the insurance company would reimburse you for those costs. And if it's hit the news or the media that you've had a breach and your reputation has been damaged, there's public relations costs involved in these policies to provide funds for you to help rebuild your reputation. But in addition to network security and privacy protection and breach response costs, the two other coverages are really being hit today, and that is the cyber extortion. So cyber extortion can take the form of what we call a ransom attack, where your information is completely locked up, or it can be a threat to lock up your information, where a threat actor actually sends information that they could only know from being inside your system. And so typically they are looking today to be paid in Bitcoin with specific instructions. Your insurance company will pay for the costs of unlocking your system if that's possible, taking your backup, getting it back onto your system, but if need be, actually paying the extortion ransom. And lastly, we have business interruption insurance, because if somebody takes control over your system and shuts it down, we had a client who was a retailer or an e-tailer selling appliances over the internet, and their systems were shut down for 3 days, and they lost 3 days of sales. And so this is an example of business interruption that would be covered under a cyber insurance policy. So this gives you an example or an idea of the kinds of insurance that's out there. As I said on the onset, it's more and more difficult to get this insurance today, and the prices generally are going up. With Elpha Secure, we have this Sterling New Age Cyber product that if you have a reasonably good assessment, you can get very reasonably cost, very broad insurance. At the end of this seminar, we're going to be distributing to you, those who opted in, your cyber assessment. And so we can talk about that at the end. I'd like to hand this back over to Elizabeth for our next speaker.
Thank you, David. And that's going to be a very valuable thing that you've offered to everybody. So thank you for that. So what about legal responsibility after an attack? Laura Ruettgers is going to walk us through this important component of cybersecurity. Let me tell you a little bit about her. Laura Ruettgers is a partner at Kaufman, Dulowich, Volek, where she also serves as the chair of the Data Privacy and Cybersecurity Practice Group. Laura has spent 2 decades representing insurance carriers in coverage disputes and litigation, including bad faith litigation. For the past 10 years, she's honed her skills in the specialty policy area, including for the last 5 years in the cyber insurance space. Most recently, Laura assisted her carrier client in resolving a multi-million-dollar breach involving payment kiosks across the nation. Laura enjoys working with emerging risks and policy language and excels at assisting the insured carrier relationship throughout the breach response process. Laura, thank you for joining us.
Hey, good morning. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, SterlingRisk, for hosting this. Good morning, everybody. I hope everybody's starting to thaw out as we get into March here a little bit. Today, I am going to talk a little bit about what happens after a breach. And I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is that you're going to be dealing with a number of critical components after a breach, and it's going to happen really quickly. The first sort of 24 or 48 hours are very critical. You're going to be handling multiple components, right? You're going to be looking at containment, find out what door the hackers came in through, what other doors they may have opened and closed those. You're going to be dealing with investigation. As David mentioned, there's lots of different information that the hackers could be looking for and could have compromised. You're going to want to find out what that is, how far the virus spread, all of that type of information. And then also at the same time, the clock is going to start running on your notification responsibilities. Okay, so for today, I'm going to be putting the spotlight on the notification component, but it's important to remember what you're dealing with is really kind of a 3-ring circus. Okay, there's a lot of different components. They're all going on at the same time, and there's a lot of overlap. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. Looking at notification, it's important to bear in mind that the notification requirements can differ based on a lot of different factors, okay? The hackers are going to be after lots of different information. So one of the things that your notification requirements could differ based on is the nature of the information that was compromised, okay? Which in part turns on the nature of your business. To the extent that you're dealing with customers and credit card information, the hackers would be happy to get that, obviously. But even if you're not dealing with credit card information of customers and that sort of thing, as David mentioned, all of us, law firms, everybody has within their systems, their employees' personal data, right? The social security numbers and those type of things that can really, the hackers can use to exploit in terms of identity theft and those types of things. So you're going to want to look at the nature of information that was compromised. Another thing you're going to want to look at is what protections did you have in place? So what were they actually able to get off your system? Is your data encrypted to the extent that you had credit card information? Do you have end-to-end encryption? So to the extent that the information was being transmitted, do you lose encryption at some point along the way? So you're going to need basically a forensic investigator to take a look at what does the data look like that the hacker got a hold of. Another factor is obviously the scope of the breach itself. Okay, how far does this spread? The hacker doesn't necessarily just want access to your system. I mean, they do want access to your system, but they want to have access to as many people and organizations that they can, okay? So the first thing really for your organization is, did they go in and look at your information? Did they pull the information off? Does somebody outside of your organization now have that information? So was it exfiltrated? And then another question is, has this spread outside of your organization, right? The hackers, as I say, they want the virus to spread as far and wide as they can. They want access to whatever information that they can get. So for example, one breach that I dealt with on the carrier side involved a company that was headquartered in the state of Washington. They had a franchise relationship with a number of companies across the nation, and they had payment kiosks. One of the things that the headquarter company did for the franchises is they handled all the IT. So they have their IT person sitting in the state of Washington. To the extent that he or she makes changes to the system, it is one-to-many technology. So as he's sitting in Washington or she is sitting in Washington and doing these changes, it gets broadcast all across the country to the various kiosks, okay? So in that situation, you had your IT person sitting in Washington, and it was actually a he got an email that looked like it was from John Smith within the organization, but the hacker had actually made a dummy email, changed one letter, and actually snuck by the IT guy. The IT guy didn't actually notice it was a dummy email. The email said, "Hey, I've been locked out of the system. Can you send me a link to redo my password?" The IT guy said, "Okay, here you go." Sent out the link. Boom, the hacker was in the system and did actually install a virus on the system, and then it went out across the country to all the different franchises, right? So you can see in that circumstance, that technology allowed the hacker to have sort of far-reaching consequences. But even like when you don't have that technology, you have a list of contacts in your email and your Outlook or whatever system you're on. So the hacker gets in, they access your list of contacts, they send emails out to all your contacts. Those people think it's coming from you, they click on a link, they might be compromised. So it's really important to find out in the early investigation, how far and wide has this spread? That obviously leads to another issue that you want to look at, the quantity of people and businesses impacted. So these are all factors that go into who do you have a responsibility to notify. Another important consideration to keep in mind is at this time, there's no overarching federal regulation in place that tells you on a nationwide basis, who do you have to notify? What does the notification have to include? What do you have to do after a breach? It's really at this point, a state-by-state regulation. So if, again, you have outside spread, it goes outside of the state that you're in, you may have different legal obligations depending on what states and jurisdictions the breach has touched. So hopefully you've got a small breach and it's very limited in nature and that's easy to deal with. Sometimes it can be wider spread than that, and that's an important thing to identify right up front to determine what your responsibilities may be. So depending on all those factors, your notification requirements could, differ. But let's say, for example, you're probably going to have a notification requirement depending on the information that was compromised internally in your company, your employees, any franchises or other like related entities that are on your same system. You can have obligations to notify people externally, customers, business partners, other contacts, things like that. Like in the example that I said, there you had the main company in Washington, all the franchises in the various states, and then also, since we're dealing with payment kiosks, customers had come in and swiped, and so you have a sort of third component of folks that you need to notify, which is the customers of each of those locations. As David mentioned, the credit card companies, you do have to often notify them as well. We've seen sometimes very hefty fines depending on how you handle the breach, depending on how the security that you had in place prior to the breach. These things are important. Banking institutions, sometimes you have to notify them as well. And then on a state-by-state basis, sometimes the Attorney General, depending on the nature of the breach and how significant it was, sometimes the Attorney General's office will also get involved. So this can obviously take a lot to untangle. I think that probably a very significant takeaway here is, if you have insurance, the best practice is obviously to get them involved as soon as possible because they can help you. Even in that first 24, 48-hour time frame, the carrier they're basically equipped. This is what they're designed to do, is to connect you with Cyber Counsel. The Cyber Counsel will retain a forensic investigator and will start to manage all of these things with an eye to sort of streamlining it down the road. So as early and often as you can get your insurance carrier involved, I think that's sort of the biggest takeaway that you can have here, is because it can really help as you continue to handle this in the weeks and months that follow a breach event. And I think that Josh is actually going to get into a little bit more of what the insurance carrier can do to help you out. So Elizabeth, I will send it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for that important information. How a company initially handles a breach is critical. So Josh Weisberg is going to discuss the associated costs and walk us through the claims process. Josh Weisberg is a director of risk management services and senior counsel at SterlingRisk, one of the nation's largest privately held brokers. As senior counsel, he has convinced carriers to withdraw declinations of coverage representing tens of millions of dollars in exposure to SterlingRisk's clients. In addition to cyber, his record includes successes in commercial general liability, commercial property, and professional liability. Josh also oversees all aspects of SterlingRisk's claims handling functionality and broader array of deliverables connected to contractual analysis, loss control, and other affiliated operations. He graduated from Fordham Law School in May 2005 and obtained his BA from Yeshiva University in September 2002. Welcome, Josh.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and good morning to all of you. David, Preetam, and Laura did a great job outlining the security issues, legal obligations, and coverages that might apply to a breach event. And Laura's absolutely right. A breach scenario can turn into a three-ring circus, and you could end up being the ringmaster. So now we're going to take a look at how you manage the breach circus and how you're going to match up the coverages David described to a breach event. Just keep in mind, there's a lot to unpack here, and cyber claims are absolutely complex. So we again look forward to taking questions after the presentation. Let's get started. First, and most importantly, you must have a breach plan. The plan is basically a playbook for who in your company and which outside consultants are going to be responsible for execution of each step of the breach investigation, containment, and outside communication processes. And there is going to be extensive communication with third parties. Laura alluded to it, and so did David. You're going to be communicating with regulators, customers, employees, vendors, and other parties. The plan will include your insurance contact for claims notices, your broker, your in-house legal or outside cyber counsel, IT, executive leadership, HR, and operations. All of these members will play a critical role on the breach team. And here's a very important tip. You do not want to wait until after breach to come up with a plan. It will drastically delay your ability to investigate, arrest, and resolve exposure related to any breach. The plan should be comprised before any loss and should be reviewed by your broker, your insurer, attorneys, IT, and operations. A plan is absolutely a technical and possibly complex document, but your cyber insurance policy may offer free legal help to structure it for you. Take advantage of those resources, leverage your broker, make sure to maximize them, and update your breach plan because it is 100% a living document that requires modification and analysis as the regulatory and threat landscape changes. Some remote environment working advice too. Make sure your plan is accessible outside of your network and make sure it's been updated for remote contingencies, such as new contact info for key employees or vendors who are working at new remote locations as a result of the pandemic. If your computer system is compromised by an attack, you may not be able to access via a remote setup. Put the plan in a secure outside location so that you can access the plan in the event that your remote connections are disabled. Now, executing on the plan, you're going to first deploy internal IT and outside vendors to confirm and contain the breach. This is where forensic investigative cost coverage comes into play, as David and Laura alluded to earlier. Get your policy on notice and make sure you deploy immediate IT, outside forensic, and breach coach resources to investigate and contain the breach. Another important tip, when using outside vendors, make sure they are on your insurance company's pre-approved panel list. The insurer on a cyber policy will not pay for non-approved vendors. Find firms you believe are qualified now, pre-breach, and incorporate their contact information into the breach plan. Attempting to negotiate payment for off-panel or non-approved vendors or attorneys will slow down the claims process and could result in delayed breach containment as you work to get vendors engaged in coordinating with your insurers. Once you've investigated, confirmed, and arrested the breach, your forensic investigators and legal counsel will assess whether any confidential or personally identifiable information has been compromised, and if so, the extent of any legal obligation you may have to notify third parties like your customers or, as David mentioned earlier, your employees. This is where notification coverage under your cyber policy is potentially triggered. Another very important tip. With respect to expenses related to notification, make sure to obtain budgets upfront from any vendor, whether forensic, legal, or otherwise, that you might engage in connection with a breach. Budgets help set parameters for possible financial exposure and provide advanced warning of unacceptable scoping or other issues that might be implicated by a vendor engagement. Budgets also help you assess whether your self-insured retention or deductible is likely to be fully exhausted by a claim and how exposed your overall total policy limit might be to the breach event. As a corollary to notification coverage, your carrier will likely deploy a call center and possibly public relations firms to help you manage any public fallout or customer inquiries related to a breach event. I can tell you from my own personal experience, another very important piece of advice. You must keep close tabs on the call center. The call center is an outside third party. Deploy internal oversight in your customer relations department to manage and monitor all call center interactions. Call center employees, as I said, are third parties. They do not know your customers. You do. Outside of handling notification, you may have regulatory or legal exposures related to fines, penalties, or damages sustained by, for example, your customers due to unauthorized exposure of private information. You must make sure to keep your insurers, broker, and legal counsel informed of any potential indication of a liability claim. Breach containment and notification is many times only the beginning of a cyber claim, the start of the circus. As Laura said, liability fallout can take months or even years to resolve. So let's take a look at some possible third-party exposures. A regulatory defense tip. Compliance issues become a much larger problem if breach response plans have not been updated to reflect remote environment variables, such as employees using their home internet connections to access your network, or internal IT security audits have not been done with usual frequency due to disruptions in IT operations related possibly to the pandemic. Assess your exposures in this area as soon as possible. Match them up to your coverage with your counsel and with your broker. You should also begin as soon as possible after breach discovery to assess possible civil exposure you have, which can include contractual, statutory, and other possible third-party exposures. Communicate those potential exposures to defense counsel and your insurers as soon as you possibly can after the claim is opened. Knowing where claims might be implicated can color how the insurer and counsel will want to structure investigation and potentially invoke attorney-client privilege. Setting aside liability coverage, your cyber policy should also cover direct losses of income you sustained as the result of a breach. This is business interruption coverage, as David referenced earlier. Your breach team should include finance, potentially outside forensic accountants, and other specialists who can deploy as soon as a breach is confirmed to document and gather all supporting evidence for a lost income claim. You do not want to attempt a reverse engineering of this support after the fact. Invariably, with time and distance and possibly systems damage caused by a breach, you may lose access to these materials and may be unable to support your lost income claim. Now, David made very important reference earlier in the presentation to extortion payments coverage, which is another form of direct loss insurance available to you under a cyber policy. Extortion payments covers ransomware attacks. As Preetam mentioned, ransomware attacks are absolutely on the rise and represented a huge share of cyber events in 2020. According to some sources, at least 80% of cyber attacks in 2020 were ransomware related. Obviously, make sure your policy has this coverage and make sure your counsel provides upfront advice on any compliance issues that might arise from making payment to ransomware attackers. The federal government has issued guidance on these payments and restrictions on these payments, and they may be very relevant to any ransomware negotiation. Have those contingencies generally incorporated into your plan to speed up the claims handling process in the event of a ransomware attack. Next slide, please, Elizabeth.
Bear with me.
There we go. Okay, good to go. Of course, it's not enough to know how a policy might respond to a breach. You must also clearly understand your obligations to your insurers and potential coverage issues or exclusions that might come into play during the course of a claim. Coverage preparation begins prior to breach by reviewing your policy and understanding timing for notice obligations. Untimely notice to the insurance company can result in full or partial denial of coverage. I have personally been involved in numerous successful challenges to an insurance company's denial of claim related to notice, but you do not want to be in that position. Get the policy on notice timely, and it will not be a concern for the progression of the claim. Understand and timely execute on other policy requirements and other conditions that are built into the insurance contract. For example, your policy will include claims made and reported restrictions. These restrictions essentially require you to report the claim to the insurance company during the same policy period in which the claim is made. If you fail to timely report, you will not have coverage. Your policy will also include what's called a proof of loss condition, which requires you to submit a proof document detailing your loss of income or other direct losses related to the claim. Usually, the proof must be filed within 90 days of loss discovery. If you fail to timely submit the proof, you may not have coverage for the claim. And one last breach plan tip. Build all of these timing considerations into the breach plan. I've seen so many plans that do not include this specific detail. You don't want to lose sight of the timing restrictions in your cyber policy as you're dealing with the larger context of a breach claim. Lastly, let's take a quick look at some coverage issues that are specifically connected to remote working. In your policy, you represent that certain security controls are in place. If you've changed security controls or increased remote activity via work from home setups, this may be a coverage problem. Check your policy application to see what you described your security setup as, and if there have been any changes, make sure to update your broker and your insurer. If you don't, the carrier may deny coverage for a subsequent loss. You also need to check the definition of computer systems and breach event in your cyber policy. These are core terms that govern the coverage trigger for almost every claim under a cyber insurance contract. Remote laptops and mobile devices may not be included in these definitions. If so, a breach involving an employee's laptop or remote device may not be covered. Check these definitions carefully and be prepared to address any gaps. So in conclusion, to wrap things up, I want to stress how important preparation for a cyber claim is to your business in this current operating environment. Here are some very quick stats to consider, and Preetam mentioned a few of them earlier. In 2020, 80% of firms saw an increase in cyber attacks. A cyber attack, according to some sources, is attempted every 39 seconds. The damage related to cybercrime is projected to hit $6 trillion annually by 2021. Ransomware attacks rose by 148% in March 2020. And finally, phishing attempts have increased by more than 660% since March 1st, 2020, correlating with the beginning of the pandemic. The best way to prepare is to focus on the key factors we touched on today. Know the types of threats that exist. Deploy robust security consultation. Have a full breach plan in place. Make sure you have a cyber policy and have a working knowledge of its most important terms. And make sure your insurance professionals are working to keep you aware of any changes to coverage that might be required as your operations continue to evolve in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Thanks so much for your time and attention today, and I'll turn it back to Elizabeth.
Wow, Josh. I mean, listening to you and to everybody else, it's so important to reach out to people that know what they're talking about, because there is so much involved and so much at stake. Thank you all so very much for this incredible information. I know we have a lot of great questions. If it's okay, I'd love to be able to pose some of them to our wonderful panel. Jerry wanted to know, do you recommend to back up an external hard drive, the cloud or both?
So I'll take that one.
Thank you.
And with that, I would say it's a combination of the two. I know that's not as gratifying of an answer. Cloud backup is essential. Use a provider like AWS, Amazon Web Services. You have duplication of your data by virtue of Amazon. It's very robust and it's always there. However, it's quite expensive. And you can't back up all of your data, and there's other considerations. So I recommend you back up your critical data on the cloud, and I'd recommend a complete backup of your system on a local removable hard drive. The issue with hard drives is people tend to not back up their data as frequently as they should. I'm guilty of it too. I should be backing up my data every week. A week goes by, and if I don't do it, that means my backup is not as up to date as it should be. So you should definitely do both.
Thank you. And you also mentioned something that really stuck out to me was about having a system in place to change your passwords and to do that on a regular basis as well. And I think that's something else that maybe people think about in the back of their minds, but don't do, and how critical it is to do that.
Yeah, and just a little cheat sheet item that we use in our company is that we actually set a calendar event every 90 days for all of our employees to get an email to change their passwords. And we actually don't allow them to access any systems in our ecosystem via VPN or RDP, actually remote desktop protocol, without changing their passwords very frequently.
And is that something that you can help companies set up internally so that there's that kind of, I guess it's almost like a lock if you don't change your password?
Yeah, absolutely. Elpha Secure, which, we're very fortunate for our partnership with SterlingRisk. We actually provide a software that helps companies automate a lot of these security threats, including password rotation, as we call it, RDP, multi-factor authentication, even the backup piece that we're talking about. We're able to help you do your cloud-based backups on your behalf in a secure, encrypted format.
And I just want to add onto that. There was a question in the queue I saw about how they get an assessment. Anybody who opted in when registering for this webinar is going to get their assessment for free of charge. And anybody who didn't opt in, just send an email to Elizabeth, and she will get it to us, and we will get you your assessment right away. And one other thing I'll add to the password question, which is fascinating. I learned last year that if you have a 5-letter or number password, it takes a supercomputer just a few minutes to guess it. And when you start increasing the number of letters in your password, it starts increasing the length of time. When you have a 9-letter or number password that includes both a capital and a small letter, a number and a special character, I think it takes something like 2 or 3 years for a supercomputer to crack it. So that's why that's the most secure, and that's why you change it every 60 to 90 days.
Great, thank you for that. And that's very interesting to know that what the two of you are working on is something that can help companies be able to manage this internally. And that program that you have, wonderful. Brian had a question. Oh, and by the way, I just put my email in the chat. It's elizabeth@schnepsmedia.com, but I did put it in the chat. And in 24 hours, you'll also get an email from me as well, but it's right there. So feel free to email me immediately. Jerry wanted to know, Brian wanted to know, what would a really good antivirus solution be for a small business? Is there a specific product, or is that really dependent upon their business and what they need?
I can give you a really concise answer, which is Elphaware, which is an excellent product, provides all the antivirus needs for a small business. There's a number of great providers out there. There's a lot of people, McAfee, Avast, which is a free solution as well. There's a number of great antivirus solutions out there, but an antivirus, one point that I want to really emphasize, is not the entirety of your security posture. That's only a very small piece of a greater puzzle. And it's really assembling your security posture, similar to how Josh mentioned. It's not just one piece, it's every piece: incident response. It's what is your disaster recovery plan? It's antivirus, it's insider threat, network security, email security, backup. Those are all components of a security posture. So I would really emphasize that there are great antivirus products out there, but I'd also focus on the greater landscape of all the things that you need for your business.
And
Important.
Preetam, you've been a big proponent of dual authentication, and you may want to just mention that.
Yeah, absolutely. Multi-factor authentication, dual factor authentication, basically meaning two modes to verify your identity. I would recommend that for everyone, for any option. If you use your email account, Gmail, they've already got a built-in protocol for you to get multi-factor with your phone. I'd recommend anytime you have two-factor authentication as an option, sign up. It will drastically improve your security.
I may also mention really quickly on this that these security measures that Preetam is talking about are good for preventing a breach, but also in the aftermath of a breach. That's what these government agency, credit card companies, that's what they want to see, is that you did everything right. So it can help you on the front and back end.
Thank you, Laura. We actually have another question for you, Laura. At what point, Margo wanted to know, at what point do you notify the FBI, if at all?
I mean, I think that's why, that's a really good question. It's really sort of a case-by-case specific kind of a thing, depending on all the factors. So that's really kind of harkens back to, and I sound like a broken record, to get your carrier involved, get them, cyber counsel involved and all that, the forensic investigators and all that, to assess what the risk was, what the breach was like, and that sort of thing, to determine that. There's not really, I can't really have an easier answer than that, unfortunately.
I could just add on one point to that. With respect to a lot of the biometric data protection legislation that's either been passed or is in the process of being passed, and then also, obviously, in addition to ransomware attacks, which we've been discussing during the presentation, OFAC, which is a federal arm that sometimes gets involved in overseeing compliance issues related to ransomware payments. One of the things that they've stressed is that if a ransomware payment is going to be made outside of the United States to nation actors that may be on US federal sanctions lists, if you notify them up front that this is a possible contingency, they'll look at that as good faith compliance in the event that you're going to be making payments. So to that end, and to that issue, in terms of whether you're notifying the FBI as an arm of the federal government, there are other arms of the federal government, OFAC being part of the Treasury, that you may also want to get involved. And to Laura's point, that's where Cyber Counsel is so critical in working with you to navigate some of these steps, because even if the policy is available to pay that ransom, you need to make sure that you're not paying that ransom and then buying yourself another problem by not notifying OFAC of that potential issue.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Bradley has a question. He said, with cyber extortion, David mentioned that they're already in your network. Does that mean they have also accessed your backups, regardless of where the backup data is stored?
Again, a not so gratifying answer here. It depends. And it's really a function of how you do your backup. So if you're using cloud backup solutions, and depending on the configuration of your backup, they can actually tamper with your backup protocols. So that's why when you use a cloud backup solution, it's very important to be very wary of the configuration settings. When you think about the configuration on your local settings, it is possible that a hacker enters your endpoint, your computer, and starts exfiltrating data. That is definitely a form of ransomware that's taking place, where people come in, cyber criminals, not bad people, come in and they encrypt your data and they ransom your key back to you. After you pay the ransom, they are then notifying you, we will share your data into the wild. So that is definitely happening to an extent. The vast majority of ransomware today, though, is focused primarily on just ransoming you for your data, because it is the easiest way to capitalize on it. Releasing your data to the wild, there's no immediate gratification, similar to ransoming you for the encryption key? So the answer is it depends. And that's why really properly configured backups is essential. Multi-factor authentication there too.
And one thing you should keep in mind is that a typical hack means that the cyber criminals have been stalking you or even in your system for months before they actually perpetrate the attack to determine what controls that you have. So imagine somebody who's in your system for months and, as Preetam says, changes your backup protocol so you're not backing up what you need. So when they encrypt what you have, you really are beholden to them. Preetam had mentioned something earlier. He said if you have a local backup, he said removable hard drive, because the idea is back it up, remove it. If your hard drive is removed, there's nothing that they can do with it, except if they're in your system for months, they may be able to tamper with what you're exactly backing up, and some of your later backups may not be valid. So that's what you have to keep in mind.
You also very much need to keep in mind that you're going to be dealing potentially with the ransomware attack itself, but also as a corollary to that, there's obviously going to be breach notification obligations that also get built into that, to the extent that they did access potentially personally identifiable information or confidential information. There will be notification obligations that get built into that as well.
One other quick tidbit I'd like to throw in about the backup, which I've omitted, is that be very wary when you use a service that automatically backs up your data on your behalf. Because if a cyber criminal comes and encrypts your data will be encrypted and effectively changed in the eyes of an automatic backup tool. That's where the Elpha solution is very strong, is we keep multiple instances of your data so we can restore you to a last known good state. However, most backup providers are not built exclusively for ransomware and do not take these things into consideration and actually back up ransomed or encrypted data onto your backup solution. So effectively, you might think you're safe with a backup in the cloud, when in reality, you've just backed up a encrypted data file.
That's an important distinction, so that, because I'm sure a lot of people do think they're safe because they have that in place, and it's important to know you're not. Mark has a question. He said, with regards to social engineering, how can you protect yourself when one of your customers are hacked and they wind up paying someone else when they thought they paid you? They often dispute the fact that their system was compromised and blame the vendor. Is this something that insurance covers? And Preetam, you're smiling. I guess you've seen this situation.
So I think we're all smiling.
Okay.
We've seen this exact situation multiple times. So think about it this way. If I owe you money and I paid it to a cyber criminal instead of to you, I still owe you that money. I haven't sent you that money. The complicating factor is if I'm a very big customer of yours, I'm gonna say to you, hey, wasn't my fault, and I've already paid the money, even if it didn't go to you. But from a legal standpoint, and I invite Josh or Laura to correct me, if I have a debt to you and I haven't paid it, I still owe that debt. So then it becomes me, the customer. Do I have the insurance to cover me if I was hacked? If I got into this social engineering or cyber deception situation? So that's point number one. So now let's make it a little more complicated in the example that our questioner gave us. So what if I'm going to pay Josh, and Josh's system was hacked so that there's a legitimate email that came from Josh's system to me correcting the payment instructions so that it goes someplace else. So then I would have the right to say to Josh, I only changed it because you told me to in a legitimate email that was from your hacked system. So there may be in that situation some coverage from Josh's company that he was actually infiltrated and that we lost a payment because of errant instructions that were given by somebody who actually entered into our computer system. Having said that, we feel very strongly, and we implemented this a few years ago in our company. Nobody changes wiring instructions using texts or emails, period. The only way to accept any instructions, new or changes, is with verbal instructions from the client and checked. And if I'm sure most of you are doing that already, but if you're not, you really have to adopt that protocol, and that's the best way to protect against social engineering.
Thank you so much. Alben has a question. For those of us who work with many subcontractors, vendors, etc., what can we do as a company in order to heighten their cyber posture? Should I make cyber insurance a part of our agreements?
I guess I'm happy to jump in on that one. So this is something that we at Sterling, and I know Laura does this as well very frequently. The short answer is yes. There are absolutely things that you can do to build into your contracts protections that you have. Number one, requiring a counterparty to have cyber insurance, and certainly making sure to do whatever you can to enhance the warranties that they're providing to you in terms of the systems they're deploying to protect data, to protect confidential data, and to protect data that's protected by statute or regulation. That's called what we in the business call risk transfer. It should absolutely be a focus of your business plan, your business model when you're negotiating these contracts. And it is something that we provide advice on all the time. And we even have template agreements that we've built out specifically to address these kinds of contingencies.
Terrific, thank you. As a follow-up to that, Margo was wondering if there any impact or changes to existing NDA. But I guess, you know, similar.
Yeah, right. I think that the from an NDA perspective, remember, from a cyber insurance perspective, the coverage is always funneled through data breach and computer system. So to the extent that there's been some form of disclosure of confidential or proprietary information that's protected within the cyber policy, yes, it's possible that an NDA would give rise or have a triggering event for a cyber policy. It would depend on a case-by-case basis, the specific information that's protected by the NDA. That could all very much come into play. But it's an interesting question.
It is. It's a good question, and really as many belts and suspenders as you can have in this arena. And there's some of the tools. So we all kind of rely on each other and any of our contacts to be cyber secure, because a breach anywhere, as we've talked about, can have, you know, widespread implications. And there's really only so much you can do, right? If it's a subcontractor or a customer, that sort of thing. But you can use some of the existing things we have, like contracts, as Joss says. You can require cyber insurance. We often see indemnity provisions. You can expand the indemnity provisions to cover you in the event of a cyber breach or that sort of thing too, and just kind of do whatever you can to sort of bolster those provisions is probably a good idea. That's a really good question.
Thank you. So for next step for a attendee who has a business or is part of a business, what would be the next step for them? You know, they've heard all of this, they understand they're vulnerable, they want to know where they're vulnerable and what the next steps will be. What do you recommend the next steps? Is it reaching out to SterlingRisk? What would be the next step for them to understand what's happening in their business and how to protect their business?
So yeah, I would say, so when we're done, actually, I don't know if Preetam has sent it already, but either now,
2 minutes.
in 2 minutes,
Okay.
Preetam will be releasing to everybody who requested a cybersecurity vulnerability assessment. And those who email you, Elizabeth, who didn't sign up for that originally, they'll get it. And then I would reach out to SterlingRisk. You'll get our contact information as a follow-up to this webinar. And we can help walk you through the cyber assessment to help you understand what the implications are, what it would cost to buy cyber insurance if it's available for you based on the assessment, or what you need to do in order to get a roadmap to get a better assessment. And that's really the next steps. That's what I would do here. And I'd follow the advice of Laura and Josh in being prepared, putting together your breach response plan, and getting everything in line so that not only do you have insurance to protect you, but you're more, as Preetam said, more cyber resilient.
Terrific. Thank you for that. And I just put in the chat my email address, and I also shared that this has been recorded, and it will be available on the Schneps Media YouTube channel within 48 hours. And you will be able to share it and watch it and get all this valuable information. Additionally, I am going to send you all the information on contacting our panelists so that you can get started and secure your company and answer questions. And I know that Preetam is very close to sending out the assessment, which is going to be a great first step, as David shared. And I wanted to say thank you so much. This has been, honestly, we could be on this call for another 3 hours with the incredible information that you've all given. And so we really appreciate your spending the time with us and sharing this critical information. I know that I've learned a lot. And I'm going to be on the phone with the rest of my company with the things that we need to do because it's so critical. And you really need a team that understands what each individual company needs and how to set yourself up so that you're not dealing with all of this afterwards without any of this assistance. So thank you so much. Preetam, are you almost ready to release?
Yeah, they're getting released as we speak. So there are batches that are getting sent out of my inbox as we speak. They are.
That is exciting. It is like Christmas morning here. In short order, you will be able to go to your email. You may have already received it and be able to get your risk assessment. Again, if you did not sign up for it ahead of time, no worries. Send me an email. We'll get that information to you. Everyone is saying thank you. Best webinar ever. Great information. So thank you so much to our panelists. Really valuable information, so appropriate for where everybody is today. Thank you so much to our attendees for taking your time to join with us and learn about how to secure your company and the importance of that. So I do appreciate it. And like I said, you will be hearing from us and get all the important information so you can be sure to secure your company. I want to wish everyone a wonderful day, a wonderful afternoon. Please, everyone, stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll look forward to seeing you on a future webinar.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.